A single pen stroke once held the power to shatter an empire. In the Middle Ages, the most dangerous secrets were not kept in vaults, but in the minds and manuscripts of scribes. These men swore unbreakable oaths to protect the confidential plans of kings and popes, becoming the invisible guardians of order and power. You are about to discover the true stories of 25 such scribes who chose to break their vows. We will uncover why they risked everything from brutal execution to eternal damnation, and how their stunning betrayals redirected the flow of history itself, toppling thrones and sparking wars. What drove a trusted clerk to smuggle a world-changing map, or a monk to defy the Pope? By the end of this journey, you will understand how the act of writing down a secret could be the most revolutionary act of all. When is loyalty to the truth more important than loyalty to a king? The weight of a scribe's oath was as heavy as the stone walls of the castle he served. This was a sacred vow, sworn not just with words but with a hand placed upon a holy relic or a sacred Bible. In that moment, a simple clerk was transformed into a guardian of secrets, his loyalty bound by both divine law and the earthly power of his king or pope. He became a human firewall, the living, breathing container for the most volatile information in the realm. His quill drafted the terms of fragile peace treaties. His ears alone heard the whispered strategies of royal councils. His hands copied the letters that could spark an alliance or condemn a rival. To break this oath was to commit a dual crime, a sin against heaven that guaranteed excommunication, and a treason against the crown that promised a brutal public end. The punishment for betrayal was designed to be a spectacle, a warning to all who might consider the same path. Execution was a mercy compared to the drawn-out agony of mutilation, a permanent disfigurement that marked a man for life. This immense pressure forged a constant, grinding conflict within the scribe's soul. Every day he balanced his sworn duty against his own private conscience, his faith, or his fears. It is this very tension, this silent war fought in the heart of a trusted servant, that makes the shattering of their vows not an act of simple treachery, but a deeply human drama of catastrophic choice. A state secret in the Middle Ages was not a marked file in a locked cabinet. It was any piece of knowledge that could topple a kingdom if it fell into the wrong hands. This definition was breathtakingly broad, covering everything from the planned rout of a royal army to the hushed-up affair that cast doubt on an heir's legitimacy. It could be the precise contents of a peace treaty negotiated in shadow, or the secret correspondence between a king and a rival pope that would shatter the faith of his people. The system for protecting these secrets was not one of paperwork and protocols, but of people and their peril. There were no official stamps reading top secret. Instead, security rested on a fragile tripod of intense personal loyalty, the physical difficulty of accessing a guarded parchment, and the bone-chilling fear of the punishment that awaited a loose tongue. This made the secret itself a form of power, a kind of invisible currency. Rival courts would pay fortunes for a single, verified piece of intelligence. Spies lurked in royal corridors, and bribes were offered with tempting regularity. The scribe, the man who actually wrote these words down, held this volatile power in his hands every single day. He was the living, breathing safe. Understanding this immense weight is the only way to grasp the true scale of the betrayal when one of these men finally decided to open that safe and let the world look inside. The moment a scribe chose to betray his oath was never a simple decision. It was a slow erosion of loyalty, a tipping point where one powerful motive finally outweighed a lifetime of duty. For some, the breaking point was a matter of conscience. They would spend their days copying orders for a brutal military campaign or drafting legal justifications for attacks that would starve the poor, and the weight of their complicity became unbearable. Their betrayal was an act of moral defiance, a belief that God's law was higher than the king's command. For others, the temptation was more earthly. A rival lord's agent would approach them, not with threats, but with a heavy purse of gold coins, offering a fortune for a single look at a treaty's confidential clause. In an age where a scribe's pay was modest, the lure of instant wealth could shatter the strongest vows, and then there was revenge, a passed-over promotion, a public humiliation, or a personal grievance festering in silence could transform a loyal servant into a calculated saboteur. The methods they used were masterclasses in clandestine action. A scribe might deliberately make an extra copy of a sensitive letter, its existence unknown to his superiors, and then arrange for it to be found by the right person. He could misplace a crucial scroll in a tavern frequented by foreign diplomats. Some, thinking of their legacy, would write a secret history, a true account of events hidden within the pages of an official chronicle, waiting for future generations to discover the truth. Each of these acts was a solitary gamble, a choice made in the shadows where a man decided that the cost of keeping the secret was a price his soul could no longer afford. Deep within the scriptorium of the great abbey of Cluny, the only sounds were the scratch of a quill and the soft breath of a monk at prayer. His task was a heavy one: to create a perfect copy of a papal bull, a decree sent directly from Rome. But as the Latin words flowed from his pen, his heart sank. The document pronounced the excommunication of his own local bishop, a man widely beloved by the people for his piety and charity. To the monk, this was not a holy edict, it was a political weapon, an unjust act meant to crush a spiritual rival. He was now trapped in an agonizing conflict between his vow of absolute obedience to the Pope and his profound belief in the bishop's innocence. His duty was to be a silent conduit for Rome's will, but his conscience screamed that he was facilitating a grave injustice. So, in the quiet of the night, he made a choice that would shatter his life. He prepared his inks and parchment once more and created a second, secret copy of the bull. This forbidden duplicate was then smuggled out of the abbey and into the hands of the bishop's most loyal supporters. The effect was immediate and explosive. Armed with the actual text of the decree, the bishop was able to mount a public defense, pointing out the political motivations behind the excommunication and rallying the local populace and clergy to his side. The Pope's authority, which relied on awe and unquestioning acceptance, was suddenly subjected to public scrutiny and open defiance. A significant schism tore through the regional church, all because one monk refused to be a silent partner to what he saw as a sin. The monk's fate was as severe as it was predictable. When his role was uncovered, he was ritually defrocked, stripped of his holy orders in a humiliating ceremony, and then imprisoned for life within a cold monastic cell. He traded his freedom and his soul standing within the church for a single act of conscience. His story is a powerful reminder that the first crack in an empire's foundation often comes not from an army, but from a solitary individual who decides that some truths are too important to remain secret. The quiet scratch of a pen could also be the sound of a lie being born. In the chancery of a Holy Roman emperor, a senior clerk spent his days surrounded by the instruments of power. His hands handled the wax for the imperial seal and mixed the ink for official decrees. He was a master of the formal script that gave royal commands their authority, a man trusted with the very mechanics of truth. But one day he was ordered to help draft a document that turned his stomach. It was a land grant treaty, a supposedly ancient agreement that gave his emperor a legal right to invade a neighboring duchy. The clerk, however, knew the parchment was a forgery. He had seen it aged with smoke and carefully copied in a style meant to mimic an older hand. He was being made complicit in a fiction designed to justify bloodshed. His disillusionment grew with every stroke of his pen. He watched as the emperor's court prepared for a war built on this single, elegant deception, and his personal sense of justice revolted. He could not stand by while this lie sent thousands to their deaths, so he devised a plan that turned his specialized knowledge against his master. Using his access, he secured a small piece of evidence, perhaps a discarded draft or a sample of the ink used, something that irrefutably proved the document was a modern creation. He then risked everything to smuggle this proof to a sympathetic cardinal within the church, a man known for his own disputes with the emperor's ambition. The cardinal, armed with undeniable evidence, exposed the forgery not on a battlefield but in the halls of power. The scandal was immediate and devastating. The emperor's legal justification crumbled, making him look not like a conqueror but a common trickster. His political support wavered, and he was forced to call off his invasion and enter into humiliating peace negotiations. As for the clerk, he performed his final act of secrecy by disappearing. His identity was never officially uncovered, his name simply vanishing from the court records. Most historians believe he sought refuge in the quiet anonymity of a monastery, trading the politics of the palace for the peace of the cloister. His story reveals a profound truth, that the person who knows how a lie is built holds the unique power to dismantle it. In the sun-drenched court of Norman Sicily, languages blended as freely as the cultures. Here, a Christian scribe held a rare and powerful skill, fluency in the elegant script of Arabic. His official duty was to serve as a bridge, translating the confidential messages that passed between his Norman king and the powerful Muslim emirs across the sea in North Africa. He was the trusted channel for a delicate alliance, a man who turned secret words from one tongue into another. One day, a particular message crossed his desk, its contents more explosive than any that had come before. It detailed a secret pact for a joint Norman-Arab naval operation, but this was not a plan to attack a common enemy. It was a shocking betrayal, a design to strike against the kingdom's own Christian allies along the Italian coast. The scribe was suddenly trapped in a terrible conflict of loyalties. His oath was to his king, the man who paid his wages, but his faith and his blood tied him to the very people the king was preparing to sacrifice. The weight of this knowledge became unbearable. He could not stand by and allow a massacre of his co-religionists, an act of treachery that would shatter the fragile peace of the entire region. So he made his choice. Using his position, he arranged a discreet meeting with a Genoese ambassador, a representative of one of the allied city-states marked for betrayal. In a hushed conversation, he passed along the critical details of the planned naval assault. The information spread among the allies with lightning speed. They did not raise a fleet to meet the threat in open battle. Instead, they acted with swift defensive cunning. Harbors were secretly fortified, garrisons were reinforced, and their own ships were repositioned to make any attack a costly failure. When the Norman and Arab fleets arrived, they found not vulnerable ports but impregnable defenses. The planned operation was completely thwarted. The political fallout was immense and lasting. The betrayal poisoned the well of trust between the Norman court and its Arab partners, straining their carefully built relations for more than a decade. The hunt for the leak began immediately. Suspicion quickly fell upon the small circle of translators, and the Christian scribe was soon identified. His punishment was as symbolic as it was brutal. He was not executed, for his knowledge of language was still considered an asset to the crown. Instead, he was subjected to a mutilation designed to destroy the very instrument of his betrayal. His tongue was cut out, a permanent and horrifying reminder of the price of crossing the interests of kings. He was left a living testament to a single, piercing question: where does your true loyalty lie when your duty commands you to enable a crime? The corridors of power in Constantinople were a world of whispers and shifting alliances. A senior notary, a cog in the vast imperial bureaucracy, found himself handling a document so chilling it threatened to stop his heart. It was a secret order, bearing the emperor's own seal, that authorized the blinding and deposition of the emperor's own brother and co-ruler. This was not just a political maneuver, it was a sentence to a living death, a brutal act of fratricide designed to consolidate power absolutely. The notary was suddenly trapped in an impossible dilemma. His sworn duty was to the emperor, the man at the apex of the state he served. Yet the state itself was built upon the sacred principle of shared rule, and this act would tear its very foundation apart. His loyalty to the empire, to the idea of stability and lawful order, now demanded that he defy its highest authority. He could not stand by and allow this darkness to unfold. Using his intricate knowledge of the palace's social geography, he identified a network of court eunuchs known for their loyalty to the co-emperor. To these men, he passed a coded message, a seemingly innocuous piece of poetry, or a veiled reference in a routine document that contained a dire warning. It was a masterpiece of clandestine communication, a signal only the intended recipient could properly decipher. The warning worked. Alerted to the imminent danger, the co-emperor was able to rally his personal guards and key military commanders, forcing a dramatic and public confrontation with his brother. The planned silent coup was exposed to the light of day, and in the ensuing standoff, the emperor was forced to back down. The immediate assassination was averted, but the price was a short, bitter civil war as the two imperial factions clashed, draining the treasury and costing countless lives. The hunt for the leak was relentless. The notary, the man who knew too much, was inevitably captured. He was subjected to horrific torture, his body broken in an effort to make him reveal the names of the eunuchs who had carried his message. But he endured the agony in resolute silence, protecting his accomplices to the end. His final act was one of supreme defiance, transforming him from a simple clerk into a martyr. He died for a principle that would echo through the ages, that true loyalty to a nation can, in its darkest hours, require disobedience to its ruler. The ink of bureaucracy could be as potent a weapon as any sword. In the dim, parchment-filled halls of the 13th century English exchequer, one lowly scribe spent his days surrounded by towering stacks of tax rolls. His world was one of numbers, a relentless river of figures detailing the wealth of every baron and landholder in the kingdom. But as his quill moved from one account to the next, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The declared incomes of certain powerful nobles were consistently, suspiciously low. These were not simple errors, but a sophisticated system of evasion, carried out with the knowing winks and silent approvals of the very officials tasked with stopping it. The crown was being systematically robbed, its treasury weakened by the greed of the powerful and the corruption of its own servants. This scribe faced a choice far removed from battlefield betrayals or theological disputes. His was a conflict between complicit silence and a dangerous truth. He could continue his work, ignoring the fraud that enriched the mighty, or he could risk everything to expose it. Quietly, methodically, he began his own secret project. While copying the official falsified records, he simultaneously compiled a second, private ledger. In this forbidden book, he recorded the true valuations of the barons' estates, the exact amounts they owed, and most dangerously of all, the names of the corrupt exchequer officers who were allowing the scheme to flourish. This ledger was not just a list of numbers, it was a map of institutional rot. Delivering this truth to the authorities in London would have been suicide, merely handing his own death warrant to the men he was accusing. So he waited for an opportunity, for a figure from outside the corrupt local circle. His chance came with the arrival of a traveling justice, a man whose reputation for unshakable integrity was known across the land. The scribe secured a private audience and with a trembling hand presented his secret ledger. The evidence was overwhelming, meticulously organized, and utterly damning. The traveling justice acted with swift and brutal efficiency, launching investigations that bypassed the compromised exchequer officials entirely. The result was a political earthquake. Several prominent barons were hit with massive fines, their wealth and prestige severely damaged. The corrupt officers were publicly disgraced and removed from their positions, their careers in ruins. This purge did more than just refill the royal coffers. It sent a clear message that the law, in theory, applied even to the highest in the land. In a remarkable and almost unheard of turn of events, the scribe was not punished for his insubordination but rewarded for his loyalty to the crown. He was granted a safer, quieter administrative post far from the political intrigue of London, shielded from the vengeance of those he had exposed. His story stands as a rare medieval beacon, a testament to the power of a single honest man with a pen to challenge a culture of corruption and actually live to tell the tale. The silence in the royal nursery was broken only by the sound of a child's labored breathing. A French royal secretary, tasked with recording the daily life of the young dauphin, held a terrible knowledge in his heart. He was one of the very few who knew the heir to the throne was not a robust boy, but a victim of a cruel, hereditary illness that sapped his strength and promised a short life. The king, desperate to project an image of strength and a secure succession, had issued a direct command. This truth was to be buried under a mountain of official lies. The secretary watched the fragile boy, the future of France, and felt the weight of this deception like a physical chain. How could a kingdom prepare for its future if it was built upon a foundation of deliberate ignorance? He believed that the nobility, the very pillars of the realm, had a right to know the precarious state of the royal line. His loyalty to the long-term stability of France began to eclipse his fear of the king's wrath. And so he made a choice that would unleash a political storm. He carefully leaked the details of the Dauphin's true condition to the court of the Duke of Burgundy, the king's most powerful and ambitious rival. The information was a weapon, and the Duke knew exactly how to wield it. He immediately began to openly question the viability of the current succession, positioning himself and his own line as a stronger, more reliable alternative to a dying dynasty. The leak did not just reveal an illness, it shattered the illusion of royal invincibility. A succession crisis, which normally would only erupt upon a king's death, now began years, even decades early. The entire political landscape of France was thrown into chaos. Alliances shifted overnight as every powerful duke and count began to calculate their own chances, maneuvering for advantage in the power vacuum they knew was coming. The king's authority, built on the certainty of his lineage, was irreparably damaged. The secretary's act of conscience did not bring clarity, but rather decades of instability and internal conflict, proving that some truths, once set free, cannot be controlled. The city of Venice floated on a sea of secrets. Its wealth and power depended not just on its galleys, but on the invisible web of informants it maintained in every port from Constantinople to Alexandria. A senior archivist in the Doge's palace held the keys to this entire clandestine world. His daily routine was one of quiet order, meticulously cataloguing the coded reports that arrived from Venetian spies embedded within the court of the Mamluk Sultanate. He knew the real names behind the code names, the locations of the dead drops, and the methods of communication. This information was the Republic's most guarded asset, more valuable than any chest of gold ducats. But the archivist had a weakness that proved stronger than his oath. He was a slave to the dice and the cards, and his mounting gambling debts threatened to ruin him and his family. Desperation began to whisper a terrible solution. He knew a single document, a complete list of the active agents, would be worth a fortune to the right buyer. The temptation grew with every threatening note from his creditors. One evening, he made the fateful decision to betray the entire network. Using his access, he compiled the list and arranged a clandestine meeting with an Egyptian spice trader who was known to have connections to the Mamluk secret police. The transaction was swift, a heavy purse of gold exchanged for a roll of parchment that held the lives of dozens of men. The consequences were immediate and devastating for Venice. Within weeks, their spy network in the Sultanate was systematically rolled up. Agents were arrested in the night, their safe houses raided, and their channels of information severed. Several were executed as examples. The intelligence flow from a critical region went completely dark. The political and economic fallout was severe. Without its eyes and ears, Venice was blindsided in trade negotiations, losing valuable commercial privileges that had taken decades to secure. The hunt for the traitor inside the palace was furious. The archivist's sudden wealth and his access made him the prime suspect. He was arrested, subjected to a swift and public trial for treason, and found guilty. His punishment was designed to be a stark lesson for every citizen. He was taken to the space between the two great columns in St. Mark's Square, the traditional site for public executions, and beheaded. His story is a chillingly simple one, devoid of noble conscience or political idealism. It was a stark transaction where a man traded the security of his entire republic for a bag of coins to settle a personal debt. A grim reminder that the most sophisticated security systems can be undone by the most common of human vices. A single act of cultural defiance could shatter the world's largest land empire. Far from the European chanceries and monastic scriptoria, in the sprawling mobile court of a Mongol great Khan, a Chinese scribe performed his duties with quiet efficiency. His role was to translate and record the administrative decrees that governed an empire stretching from the Pacific to the Black Sea, a realm held together by the sheer force of Mongol will. It was in this position that he learned of a secret succession plan, a decree from the aging Khan that would bypass one prince in favor of another. To the Mongol court, this was a matter of imperial stability, but to the Chinese scribe, it was a death sentence for his own civilization. The chosen successor was known for his contempt for Chinese traditions, his intention to dismantle scholarly institutions and suppress the intricate bureaucracy that had governed the land for centuries. The scribe saw not just a change in ruler, but the erasure of his entire cultural heritage. His loyalty to his people and their ancient ways now directly opposed his sworn duty to the Khan who employed him. He made a perilous choice, secretly passing the details of the succession plan to the faction of the rival prince, a man who presented himself as more sympathetic to Chinese administrative methods. This was not an act of personal ambition, but of existential preservation. The information he provided was the spark thrown onto a pile of kindling. The rival prince, armed with the knowledge of his official disinheritance, rallied his supporters and declared his claim to the throne. What followed was a brutal and protracted civil war, a conflict that pitted brother against brother and tore the unified Mongol Empire into feuding khanates. The immense military strength that had once been directed outward was now turned inward, consumed in a self-destructive struggle for power. While the empire did not collapse overnight, this internal fracture marked the beginning of its irreversible decline, as the centralized power of the Great Khan gave way to the squabbling of his descendants. The Scribe's story forces us to confront a difficult question. Was his betrayal an act of treason that destroyed a political entity, or was it an act of salvation that helped protect a 5,000-year-old culture from assimilation? In the harsh calculus of survival, he determined that the unity of his conquerors was a price worth paying for the preservation of his own world. A forbidden book could be as dangerous as a traitor's map. In a secluded Spanish monastery during the height of the Reconquista, a humble scribe was performing his routine duty, copying texts to expand the monastic library's collection. His world was one of ordered devotion, a sanctuary of ink and vellum far from the religious fervor cleansing the land. Then he uncovered it. Hidden behind a loose stone wrapped in plain cloth was a manuscript written decades earlier by a former abbot. As the scribe read its pages, a chill of both awe and terror ran through him. The text did not preach orthodox Catholic doctrine, but instead wove together threads of Islamic and Jewish philosophy, arguing for a more tolerant, intellectually curious form of faith. This was the work of a forgotten, more open-minded time, a strand of humanist thought that the current age was determined to extinguish. The new command from his superior was swift and absolute. The heretical manuscript was to be burned, its dangerous ideas reduced to ash. The scribe now faced a crisis of conscience that pitted his obedience to the church against his loyalty to knowledge itself. He looked at the pages in his hands and saw not heresy but a fragile piece of truth, a bridge between worlds that was about to be shattered forever. He could not be the one to light the fire, so in the deepest secrecy of the scriptorium he began a different, perilous task. Instead of one copy for the flames, he made many. By the light of a single candle, his quill flew across fresh parchment, duplicating the forbidden words night after night. When the copies were complete, he did not hide them within the monastery's walls, where the Inquisition's agents would surely find them. He entrusted them to a network of traveling merchants and pilgrims with discreet connections, smuggling the manuscripts out of Spain and across the Alps to the rising centers of learning in Italy. His betrayal of doctrinal orthodoxy was in reality an act of profound intellectual preservation. Those smuggled pages survived, circulating among scholars in Florence and Padua, where they subtly seeded the intellectual soil. The ideas within, once marked for destruction, would eventually help fertilize the ground for the Renaissance, reminding a new generation that wisdom could be found in many traditions. The scribe's own fate remains a mystery, his name lost to the official records. He risked everything not for a king or a country, but for the simple, revolutionary belief that some ideas are too precious to burn. The ink of commerce could be as deadly as the ink of treason. In the bustling counting house of the Hanseatic League, a quiet bookkeeper spent his days immersed in columns of numbers that tracked the flow of Baltic grain. His work was a monument to order, recording the profits of the most powerful merchant alliance in Northern Europe. But as he balanced the ledgers, a different, more sinister calculation began to emerge. The numbers were too perfect, the prices for grain moving in an unnatural lockstep across different merchant houses that were supposed to be competitors. He had stumbled upon a silent conspiracy, a secret pact among the leading Hanseatic families to artificially inflate the price of the region's most vital commodity. While merchants grew fat on their illicit profits, the consequences were measured in human suffering. Reports trickled in from Scandinavia of bread riots and famine, of families who could no longer afford the very grain that fed their children. For this bookkeeper, the neat columns of figures transformed into a ledger of guilt. His moral outrage became a weight heavier than any chest of silver. He faced a terrible choice: remain a silent accomplice to a crime that starved thousands, or risk his life, his livelihood, and the wrath of the most formidable commercial power on the continent. He chose to make the numbers speak the truth. Working with meticulous care, he compiled a secret set of account books. These were not the official, sanitized records, but the raw evidence that irrefutably traced the price-fixing scheme, showing the coordinated manipulations and the hidden transfers of wealth. He could not simply walk into a town square and announce his discovery. The League's reach was long and its punishment severe, so he devised a plan of anonymous delivery, sending the damning ledgers to the city council of a starving Scandinavian port, a place where the hunger and anger were at their peak. The evidence landed like a lit fuse in a powder keg. The city council, armed with undeniable proof, made the documents public. The result was an explosion of popular fury. Riots erupted not against the local bakers, but against the Hanseatic warehouses and offices. The city, followed by others, declared a temporary but devastating embargo against the League's traders, freezing their assets and banning their ships. The economic pressure was immediate and unbearable. The secret cartel, exposed and under siege from the very people it exploited, shattered. Grain prices plummeted back to their natural level as the merchants scrambled to save their individual businesses. The conspiracy was broken and food once again became affordable. The identity of the bookkeeper was never discovered, his name lost to history, a ghost who used paperwork as his weapon. His story stands as a powerful testament that the most dangerous secrets are not always about crowns and treaties. Sometimes they are found in the pages of an account book, where a single honest man can use his pen to confront an entire system of greed and restore the balance between profit and humanity. Words themselves became the weapons of a silent war. In the court of a Scottish king, a trusted scribe held the power to shape reality with his quill. His official duty was to draft the king's diplomatic letters, the very documents that would define Scotland's stance in its desperate struggle for independence from England. Each word was chosen with precision, meant to project strength, resolve, and the unshakable legitimacy of the Scottish crown. But this scribe was living a double life. For years, he had been accepting a secret pension from the English treasury, a regular payment that bought not just his silence but his active treachery. His method was one of subtle sabotage, so insidious it was almost invisible. He would not change the core message of a letter, for that would be far too obvious. Instead, he would alter the tone, the nuance, the very spirit of the words. A phrase declaring firm resolve would be softened into a statement of hopeful negotiation. A demand for rights would be rephrased as a polite request. A threat of military consequence would become a vague expression of concern. Over time, this deliberate weakening of the Scottish diplomatic voice had a corrosive effect. The English recipients of these letters began to perceive the Scottish king as uncertain, perhaps even ready to compromise on the very sovereignty he was fighting for. It emboldened the English position and sowed seeds of doubt among Scotland's own allies, who wondered if their king truly had the fortitude to see the war through. The discovery came not from a grand mistake, but from the sharp eye of a suspicious Scottish courtier. This man, comparing an early draft of a letter with the final, sealed version, noticed the subtle but crucial shifts in language, the slow bleed of resolve from the text. The evidence was there, written in the scribe's own hand. The betrayal was one not of loud proclamations, but of quiet, calculated erosion. His public hanging was a stark lesson to every person in the kingdom. It demonstrated that the enemy was not always at the gates with swords and banners. Sometimes the enemy sat in the council chamber, dressed in the robes of a loyal servant, using the trusted tools of his office to dismantle a nation's will from within, one carefully chosen word at a time. Even the treasury of God could be corrupted by the greed of men. In the heart of the Vatican, a papal chamberlain performed a duty that should have been a sacred act of stewardship. His hand recorded every expenditure from the church's vast treasury, a river of gold intended for charity, for scholarship, for the very upkeep of Christendom's soul. But as his quill moved down the ledger, a sickening pattern emerged. The funds were not flowing to the poor or the universities. They were being systematically diverted, siphoned off into the coffers of the Pope's own nephews and cousins, funding their lavish palaces and political ambitions. This was not mere favoritism, it was a wholesale looting of the faithful's donations, a betrayal of spiritual trust for the enrichment of a single family. The chamberlain's disgust grew with every entry he was forced to write. His oath was to the church as an institution, to its spiritual mission, but he was being made an accountant for its moral decay. He could no longer be a silent witness to this sacrilege, so he began a second, secret project. In the solitude of his chamber, he compiled a duplicate ledger, a meticulous and damning record. This ledger of shame did not just list amounts, it named names. It traced the pathways of corruption from the papal vaults directly into the pockets of the Pope's relatives. He knew that exposing this to the public was impossible, but he believed a spark of conscience still existed within the church's own hierarchy. He carefully leaked the ledger to a single cardinal, a man renowned for his austerity and his vocal criticism of the papal court's excesses. The cardinal now possessed not just accusations but irrefutable evidence. He used the ledger as the central weapon in the growing conciliar movement, a powerful faction of clerics and intellectuals who argued that the Pope's absolute power needed to be checked by the collective authority of a church council. The scandal erupted with the force of a theological earthquake. The ledger of shame was copied and circulated among bishops and university theologians, providing tangible proof that the man claiming to be Christ's vicar on earth was running a family business with the church treasury. The conciliarists now had the moral high ground, and their arguments for reform gained immense traction, plunging the papacy into one of the most severe crises of authority it had ever faced. The chamberlain's fate was a quiet but definitive end. There was no public trial, for that would only have amplified the scandal. Instead, he was summoned by a superior, offered no thanks and no apology, and informed of his promotion to an administrative post in a remote, windswept diocese far from the centers of power. His career was over, his life's work effectively erased, yet the ledger he created continued to speak long after he was silenced, proving that a single record of truth could challenge the very throne of St. Peter. The fall of a kingdom can sometimes be traced to a single crack in a stone wall. In the final, glittering century of the Emirate of Granada, a scribe worked within the magnificent Alhambra Palace, his world a symphony of intricate arabesques and the gentle sound of fountains. His duties brought him into contact with the fortress' most mundane yet vital documents, the engineering reports from the master builders who maintained the massive defensive walls. It was in one of these dry technical scrolls that he found a terrifying truth. The report detailed a critical structural flaw in a key bastion, a section where the stonework had been compromised by underground water seepage, leaving it vulnerable to sustained artillery fire. For a time, this was merely a piece of administrative knowledge, a problem to be scheduled for repair. But as the political atmosphere soured and the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella drew ever closer, that technical detail began to feel like a premonition of doom. The scribe watched the emir's court, a place still devoted to poetry and philosophy, and saw a realm living on borrowed time. He was not driven by a grand moral crisis or a thirst for revenge, but by a cold, pragmatic calculation for survival. In a world he believed was inevitably ending, his only duty was to himself and his family's future. So he made a quiet, deliberate choice. He arranged a discreet meeting with a Castilian agent operating in the city and traded the specific location of the wall's weakness for a promise of safety and a position in the new Christian administration he knew was coming. This was not a dramatic act of espionage but a grim transaction. The information was filed away, a dormant weapon in the Castilian arsenal. Years later, during the final, brutal siege of Granada, that long-forgotten secret was activated. Spanish commanders, recalling the intelligence, directed their heaviest cannons to pound relentlessly at that single, compromised section of the fortifications. The wall, as predicted, crumbled faster than any other, creating a breach that exhausted the city's defenders and hastened the final negotiations for surrender. The scribe achieved his hollow victory, surviving the conquest and likely fading into the anonymous bureaucracy of the new regime. His story forces us to confront a difficult kind of betrayal, one born not of malice, but of a despairing certainty that the old world is beyond saving. He did not bring down the Emirate of Granada by himself, but he provided the precise leverage that made its fall swifter, trading a secret for a life in the ruins. The cold of a Prussian winter seeped into the stone halls of the Teutonic Order's fortress, but it was a different kind of chill that gripped the scribe as he read the letter. His duty was to record the official correspondence of a knight commander, a man celebrated for his ferocity in the Holy War against the pagan Lithuanians. But this document was not a report of a battle won. It was a draft agreement for a secret trade route, outlining the exchange of Baltic amber and timber for silver, negotiated directly with the very tribal leaders the order was sworn to exterminate. The commander was not planning a new crusade, he was building a private commercial empire with the enemy. For this scribe, a man whose entire identity was forged in the fires of religious zeal, this was not mere corruption. It was a sacrilege, a poisoning of the order's sacred purpose. His oath demanded he serve his commander, but his faith screamed that his true duty was to God and the purity of their crusade. He watched as the commander grew wealthy, his illicit dealings hidden behind the banner of the cross, and knew that this hypocrisy was a greater threat to their souls than any pagan army. He made a choice fueled not by greed or personal grievance, but by a burning, unforgiving idealism. He gathered the incriminating letters and requested a private audience with the Grand Master himself. In that austere chamber, he presented the evidence, his hand steady, his conviction absolute. The fallout was swift and severe. The knight commander was publicly stripped of his white mantle, defrocked in a humiliating ceremony, and cast into a dark monastic prison for the rest of his days. But the scribe's victory for orthodoxy had a terrible, unintended consequence. To reassert its doctrinal purity and crush any appearance of compromise, the Teutonic Order launched a new military campaign against the Lithuanians, one of exceptional brutality meant to erase all memory of the failed truce. Villages that might have been spared were put to the torch, and the conflict entered its bloodiest chapter. This scribe did not break his oath to undermine power, but to enforce it in its most rigid form. His story forces a difficult question: can an act of loyalty to an ideal become a greater engine of destruction than any act of treachery? The scent of ink and old coin hung in the air of the Florentine counting house, a place where wealth was measured in ledgers, not land. A secretary to one of the city's most powerful bankers spent his days surrounded by the quiet hum of finance, his pen tracing the flow of capital that connected the merchant republics to the crowned heads of Europe. His position granted him an intimate view of the delicate architecture of credit, a system built on confidence as much as coin. Then he saw the truth hidden within the columns of a private ledger. His bank, was perilously overextended, its fate tied to massive, unpayable loans made to the French crown. The king's debt was a sword of Damocles hanging over the entire enterprise, and its fall would not be a quiet failure but a cataclysm. This was not just a business secret, it was a state secret of the highest order, for the stability of kingdoms was woven into these financial threads. The secretary faced a brutal choice governed not by loyalty or faith, but by cold arithmetic. His own life savings, his family's future, were entombed within the very vaults that were about to be sealed by ruin. His oath to his employer warred with the primal instinct for survival. In the end, the numbers spoke louder than any vow. He made a discreet visit to a trusted circle of fellow investors, men of means but not of the inner circle. His warning was delivered not in a shouted alarm, but in a hushed conversation over a glass of wine, a carefully worded suggestion that now would be a prudent time to reconsider one's investments. They understood the unspoken message perfectly. Acting with swift discretion, this small group withdrew their substantial funds, their gold quietly exiting the bank's coffers just days before the dam broke. The collapse, when it came, was as violent as it was inevitable. The sudden, inexplicable withdrawal of such a large sum was the final push that shattered the illusion of solvency. A run on the bank ensued, panic spread through the Florentine exchange, and the failure rippled outwards, dragging smaller businesses and individual depositors into ruin. A major financial crisis gripped the continent, all while the secretary and his companions watched from a safe distance, their personal fortunes secure. He had not betrayed a king or a creed, but the very trust that underpinned the world of commerce. His story reveals a chilling modern truth that in an interconnected world, the most dangerous secret is sometimes not who you are at war with, but who you are in debt to. The true death of a king was a secret too dangerous for the living to bear. In a remote Irish monastery, an analyst dipped his quill into ink, his task to record the official history of his kingdom's ruling dynasty. He had been present at the High King's bedside, witnessing the grim, undignified truth. The king had not fallen in a glorious battle against a rival clan, as the royal family now loudly proclaimed. He had succumbed to a festering wound taken during a petty, shameful raid, a squabble over stolen cattle. The king's family came to the analyst with a direct command, their eyes full of threat. He was to compose a chronicle of heroic last stands and noble sacrifice, a story that would bolster their legitimacy for generations to come. To refuse meant exile or worse, but to obey meant betraying the very purpose of his life's work, the preservation of truth for God and for posterity. So the analyst crafted a masterpiece of dual loyalty. For the public record, he produced a beautifully illuminated chronicle filled with stirring tales of the king's martial valor, a document that satisfied the royal family and was read aloud in great halls. But in secret, on a separate, hidden vellum scroll, he wrote a different account. This true chronicle detailed the humiliating cattle raid, the ignoble wound, and the slow, painful death far from any field of honor. He then sealed this scroll inside a leather satchel and hid it within the monastery's deepest library vault, a time capsule of truth meant for a future he would never see. Centuries later, long after the kingdom itself had faded into legend, that satchel was discovered. The two chronicles, side by side, revealed a profound and enduring conflict. The public lie served the political necessity of the moment, crafting a legacy of strength to hold a realm together. The hidden truth served a different master, the raw, unvarnished reality of events, preserved against the tides of propaganda. This analyst's quiet defiance forces us to ask, is history the story of what happened? Or is it the story that those in power need us to believe? His hidden scroll whispers that sometimes the most radical act is to simply write down what is real and trust that the future will understand why. The air in the papal palace at Avignon was thick with the scent of incense and ambition. A scribe within the curia moved through corridors of power that felt more like a royal court than the seat of St. Peter, his daily work involving the meticulous copying of documents related to church appointments and finances. It was in this capacity that he began to handle records of a deeply disturbing nature. These were not simple administrative lists, but explicit accounts of simony, the ancient sin of buying and selling sacred offices. He saw the price tags attached to bishoprics and cardinalates, the exact sums of gold paid by wealthy, ambitious men to secure positions of spiritual authority. The church was not being led by its most devout sons, but by its highest bidders. This scribe was a man of profound, perhaps naive, faith, and what he witnessed felt like a sickness at the very heart of Christendom. His loyalty to the institution was being systematically dismantled by his revulsion for its practices. He knew that this corruption was not a secret to everyone, but it was a carefully managed one, its evidence locked away in the vaults of Avignon. He believed that if the truth were set free, it could cleanse the church, so he began his solitary, treasonous project. He compiled a master list, a ledger of shame that named every bishop and cardinal who had purchased their rank, complete with the amounts they had paid. This was not a leak of a single document, but the creation of a new one, a weapon forged from scattered facts. He then arranged for this devastating list to be smuggled out of Avignon and into the hands of a fierce critic of the papacy living in Rome, a theologian who had long argued that the Pope's self-imposed exile in France was a source of this very moral decay. The impact was seismic. The Roman critic now had undeniable, documented proof of systemic corruption. He published the list and used it as the central evidence in a blistering campaign of sermons and pamphlets. The scandal could no longer be dismissed as the grumbling of disgruntled rivals. It gave immense credibility to the growing chorus of voices demanding the papacy abandon its lavish French captivity and return to its ancient home in Rome. This was not just a political argument anymore. It was a moral crusade backed by cold, hard facts. The leak did not just expose individual sinners, it fundamentally damaged the legitimacy of the Avignon papacy itself, pouring fuel on the theological fires that would soon erupt into the Western Schism, a period where not one, but two, and then three men would claim to be the rightful pope. The Scribes' Act was a quiet spark that helped ignite a conflagration which would split Western Christianity for generations, all because he decided that the truth about his church soul was a secret too damaging to keep. A map in the 15th century was not just a piece of paper, it was a treasure chest drawn in ink. It held the power to summon entire continents from the void of the unknown and to guide empires toward unimaginable wealth. In the service of the Spanish crown, a royal mapmaker spent his days transforming the rough sketches and terrified whispers of returning explorers into precise, beautiful charts. His hands gave form to the New World, plotting coastlines, marking safe harbors, and most critically, tracing the secret navigational routes to lands rumored to be dripping with gold. These master charts were considered state secrets of the highest order, locked away with more care than the crown jewels, for they held the key to Spain's future dominance. The mapmaker, however, looked upon his own magnificent work and saw not just imperial glory, but a personal opportunity. The official rewards for his painstaking labor were modest, a comfortable salary, but a pittance compared to the fortunes being hauled across the ocean. When an agent for a rival Portuguese explorer made a discreet approach, the temptation was overwhelming. The offer was not just a single payment, but a promise of a share in the profits from the very expeditions his stolen knowledge would enable. The risk was mortal, but the potential reward was a legacy of wealth that would last for generations. In the deep quiet of his workshop, he performed the ultimate act of duplication. Using the finest vellum and his most trusted inks, he created a perfect clandestine copy of the crown's most valuable chart. This was not a rushed tracing, but a work of art equal to the original, containing every strategic detail, every current, every landmark that could shave weeks off a dangerous voyage. The transaction was swift and silent. The copy changed hands, and the Portuguese explorer now possessed the Spanish crown's playbook. The geopolitical consequences were immediate and profound. Portugal, armed with Spain's own intelligence, could now confidently challenge its rivals' territorial claims, arguing for a reinterpretation of the papal treaties that had divided the globe. More importantly, they launched their own expeditions with a precision and speed that shocked the Spanish court, establishing footholds and extracting wealth from regions Spain had considered its private domain. The colonial race in the Americas was no longer a staggered exploration. It was a frantic, head-to-head sprint into the unknown, a rivalry intensified by a single act of treachery. The discovery of the leak sent Spanish agents fanning out across the ports of Europe and the New World, their orders simple and brutal. The mapmaker had become the most wanted man in the Spanish Empire, a ghost fleeing from the very shadow he had helped to cast across the world. He spent his remaining years looking over his shoulder, a wealthy man in exile, forever severed from the homeland whose secrets he had sold, his personal fortune a monument to the high stakes of cartographic treason. A poet's pen could wield a sharper blade than any courtier's dagger. In the opulent court of Burgundy, where tapestries glowed with gold thread and feasts stretched for days, a poet-scribe found his muse in the very scandals the nobility worked so hard to conceal. His official role was to compose verses celebrating the dynasty's glory, but his ears were sharp, and his heart nursed a bitter grudge after a public insult from the Duke left him humiliated and seething. It was in this state of wounded pride that he overheard a careless whisper, a fragment of conversation between the Duchess and a most trusted lady in waiting that confirmed a staggering secret. The celebrated heir the young man paraded before the court as the future of Burgundy was not the Duke's son. He was illegitimate, a living lie propped up to ensure a smooth succession. The poet saw his chance for a revenge more exquisite than any direct accusation. He would not shout the truth from the balconies, he would weave it into art. He composed a new poem, a beautiful and cutting allegory about a majestic swan raising a cuckoo's chick in its own nest, a creature praised for its beauty but destined to betray its true nature. The poem was a masterpiece of double meaning, its surface a fable of nature, its core a detonation waiting to happen. He ensured copies were made and circulated among the courtiers, who devoured the verses with gleeful recognition. The scandal erupted not with a bang, but with a murmur that grew into a roar. The Duke, confronted with a truth he could no longer deny, was forced to publicly disinherit the boy he had raised as his own. He named a different, legitimate, but far less charismatic cousin as his successor. This abrupt shift shattered the court's unity. Factions formed instantly, some supporting the cast-off heir, others grudgingly accepting the new one. The internal chaos was an open invitation. The King of France, always watching for a chance to weaken his powerful vassal, intervened under the guise of mediating the dispute, effectively pulling Burgundy deeper into his own sphere of influence. The poet had traded his position and safety for a moment of perfect, devastating vengeance, proving that in a world of power, the most dangerous weapon is sometimes a well-chosen metaphor. The gold that bought a king's peace was a poison. In the Hungarian royal chancery, a scribe handled documents that told two contradictory stories. Publicly, his king issued fiery proclamations calling for a new crusade against the Ottoman Sultan, rallying the nobility with speeches of holy defiance. But the scribe's own pen recorded the quiet, regular payments of tribute, the heavy chests of gold sent south to purchase a temporary and shameful peace. This was not strategy, he came to believe, but a fatal hypocrisy. The kingdom's spirit was being sapped by this double life, its warriors growing soft while the treasury bled for a security that was nothing more than a delayed surrender. His disillusionment curdled into a firm conviction that the only path to survival was a return to honor and decisive war, and so he made a choice that would trade one kind of danger for another. He secretly copied the records of the tribute payments and delivered them to a faction of hawkish barons, men who had long argued for a military solution. The evidence was a spark on dry tinder. The barons were outraged not just by the policy but by the deception. They used the documents to rally the nobility, accusing the king of cowardice and betraying the very cause of Christendom. The political storm culminated in a swift and decisive palace coup that stripped the king of his effective power. The new regime, driven by a fervent idealism, immediately ended the tribute and mobilized the entire kingdom for a final, decisive confrontation. This triumphant march of principle, however, led directly to the sun-scorched plains of Varna. There, the revitalized Hungarian army, full of righteous fury but strategically outmatched, was utterly annihilated by the Ottoman forces. The king himself was killed, his head displayed as a trophy. The scribe's act of conscience, meant to strengthen his kingdom, had instead dismantled its primary defense and hurled its military strength into a meat grinder. He had sought to cure a sickness of the spirit, only to deliver a mortal wound to the body of the nation. His story is a haunting lesson in the law of unintended consequences, where a leak meant to save a kingdom ultimately became its death warrant. Sometimes a secret is not a single document, but a map of living souls. In the Languedoc region of France, a scribe dedicated to a Cathar perfect lived a life of profound secrecy. His world was one of hidden caves and moonlit forest gatherings, his pen recording the spiritual teachings of a faith deemed heretical by the Church of Rome. He knew the location of every safe house, the identity of every other perfect, the entire fragile network of a community living under the shadow of the Crusaders' sword. When the soldiers finally found him, the choice presented was brutally simple. He could cling to his oath and face immediate execution, or he could speak and receive a full pardon for his life. In that moment of pure terror, the abstract loyalty to a cause was crushed by the primal instinct to survive. He broke his oath, he gave them everything. The names, the routes, the hiding places, the information he provided was the key that unlocked the final stronghold of Montségur for the crusading army. The result was not a battle, but a systematic eradication. Hundreds of his former friends, his teachers, his co-religionists, were rounded up and given their own terrible choice: renounce their faith or be consumed by fire. They chose the flames. A vast pyre was built at the base of the mountain, and the Cathar community was burned out of existence, their culture and their memory nearly erased from the earth in a single horrific day. The scribe lived. He was granted his pardon and faded into the anonymity he had purchased with so many lives. His story stands as the most harrowing example of betrayal, where the will to live, that most human of instincts, was weaponized to become the instrument of a genocide. It forces a question that echoes across the centuries. What would you do when the price of your own survival is the annihilation of everyone you once loved? The crisp mountain air carried the sound of church bells, not war horns, but the document in the Swiss herald's hands promised the latter. As a scribe for the Confederation, his duty was to record the agreements that bound the cantons together, yet this new contract was a poison. It was a secret treaty, negotiated by a few commanders for personal profit, that would send Swiss mercenaries into the service of both France and Milan for the same war. He saw the brutal arithmetic immediately. Brothers from neighboring valleys would be paid to slaughter each other on a foreign field, all while their leaders grew rich from the blood money. The very idea struck at the heart of the fragile Swiss identity they were struggling to build. His oath was to his employers, the men who had drafted this deal, but his loyalty was to the Confederation itself, to the farmers and craftsmen who would be sent to die in a meaningless circular conflict. He could not be the silent chronicler of such a betrayal. Risking his position and his safety, he made copies of the damning contract and sent them to the independent town councils across the cantons. He did not address the powerful but the people. The reaction was an explosion of public fury. In town squares from Zurich to Lucerne, citizens gathered, their anger directed at the commanders who had traded their lives for gold. The outcry was so overwhelming and unified that the political leaders had no choice but to capitulate. The treaty was torn up, cancelled before a single mercenary could march. But the herald's disclosure did more than just stop one war. It sparked a political revolution. The scandal led directly to the passage of new laws that strictly regulated mercenary service, forbidding Swiss from being hired to fight against other Swiss. This was a foundational moment, a point where profit was deliberately subordinated to a shared sense of nationhood. The scribe's betrayal of a secret contract ultimately helped forge a stronger, more cohesive Swiss state, proving that the act of exposing a hidden truth could sometimes be the highest form of patriotism. A promise between kings, even sworn enemies, was supposed to be sacred. In the Mamluk Sultanate, a diplomatic scribe found himself at the center of a tense negotiation for the release of a captured Crusader king. The ransom offered was astronomical, a treasure of gold and silver that would enrich the Sultan's coffers for years. The official correspondence, which the scribe dutifully translated and recorded, spoke of honorable terms and a safe passage home for the royal prisoner. But in a private council to which the scribe was privy, he heard the Sultan's true plan. The treasure would be accepted, but the king would never see his homeland again. He was to be executed immediately after the payment was secured. To the Sultan, this was a clever stratagem, a way to cripple the Crusader states by decapitating their leadership while keeping their wealth. But to the scribe, a man steeped in the codes of chivalry and diplomatic conduct, this was not cunning, it was a profound dishonor. He believed such a blatant betrayal would shatter any possibility of future truce or negotiation. It would not bring peace but guarantee a war of total annihilation, inviting an endless cycle of vengeance and brutality that would consume both sides. His loyalty to the Sultan warred with his loyalty to a principle he considered higher than any single ruler, the sanctity of a sworn agreement. He made a choice that placed his personal honor above his sovereign's command. Through a trusted intermediary, he sent a covert warning to the Crusader negotiators. He did not reveal all the details, for that would have been an act of open treason, but he gave them enough to understand the grave risk, hinting that the Sultan's word on this matter was not to be trusted. Armed with this quiet warning, the Crusader diplomats returned to the bargaining table with a new, unyielding strategy. They restructured the entire agreement, embedding stronger, more public guarantees. They demanded the release of other high-ranking prisoners first as a show of good faith, and they arranged for the final exchange to happen in a neutral, observed location, making a secret execution impossible. The Sultan, faced with this unexpectedly shrewd and fortified position, was forced to relent. He took the vast ransom, but he also honored the revised terms, releasing the Crusader king to return home. The scribe's quiet intervention had averted a catastrophic breach of faith that would have poisoned the conflict for generations. His actions demonstrated that a single individual's conscience could hold the line against the cynical calculations of power, preserving a fragile thread of honor in a time of relentless war. The law was not written on parchment but spoken from memory. In the cold air of a Norwegian assembly, the law speaker's voice was the law itself, a living archive of ancient codes passed down through generations. His young apprentice stood beside him, learning every syllable, every inflection that dictated the rules of inheritance, of property, of life itself. And as he listened, he grew to despise the injustice he was being taught to preserve. The code was brutally clear, systematically favoring the noble families, ensuring their lands grew while commoners were locked out of their own family legacies. He watched hardworking farmers lose their ancestral fields on a legal technicality, all while the law he was sworn to uphold declared it just. His conscience would not allow him to become a vessel for this archaic unfairness. So he began a quiet, audacious rebellion. When his turn came to recite at smaller regional assemblies, he did not recite the law as it was. He recited the law as he believed it should be. With a steady voice, he would alter key clauses, subtly shifting inheritance rights to give commoners a fairer claim. A provision that once granted a distant noble cousin precedence over a farmer's own daughter was quietly reversed. A rule that funneled a widow's property back to her husband's lord was amended to allow her to keep it. At first, the changes went unnoticed, buried in the complex web of oral tradition. But the effects were immediate and tangible. Disputes that should have been settled easily now erupted into fierce arguments, with different people swearing they had heard different versions of the law recited at different assemblies. The entire region was plunged into a state of legal chaos, where no one could be certain of their rights or obligations. The foundation of social order, which relied on the perceived immutability of the spoken code, began to crack. The ruse was inevitably discovered when a sharp-eared noble, hearing the apprentice recite at one assembly and the master at another, noticed the discrepancies. The apprentice was seized, his betrayal of the sacred oral tradition seen as a profound crime against the social order. His punishment was severe, likely involving exile or a heavy fine, a stark price for his ideological crime. Yet the confusion he deliberately sowed had already done its work. The legal disputes he sparked could not be simply ignored. They forced the chieftains and elders to confront the glaring flaws in their own system. The very chaos he created became the catalyst for a formal, top-to-bottom review of the entire inheritance code. The debate he started in the assembly fields eventually led to the painful but necessary process of writing the laws down and modernizing them, creating a fairer, more transparent system for everyone. His was not a leak of a single secret, but the calculated corruption of an entire system of knowledge, a desperate gamble that sometimes, to fix a broken law, you must first break your oath to recite it. The quiet rustle of parchment in a university lecture hall could conceal a revolution. In the heart of the University of Prague, one scribe's daily task was to faithfully record the words of a popular master, Jan Hus. His lectures were not dry academic exercises, they were electrifying calls for a church purified of corruption, a return to the simplicity of the Gospels. The scribe's hand moved quickly, capturing every challenging idea, every critique of papal authority and clerical wealth. He was creating a perfect record of a movement taking shape. Then the condemnation came from Rome. Jan Hus was declared a heretic, his teachings banned, his very words deemed a spiritual poison. The university authorities, bowing to this pressure, issued a direct command. The scribe was to bring all his notes, every transcript of those incendiary lectures, and burn them. To him, this was not an order to destroy paper, but to erase truth. He looked at the stacks of transcripts, each page filled with arguments about faith accessible to the common person, and he saw not heresy, but hope. His obedience to the institution shattered against his belief in the ideas he had spent so long preserving, and so he made a choice that would turn academic notes into weapons of war. He did not burn a single page. Instead, he became the silent architect of an underground network. He quietly recruited other students and sympathetic copyists, turning hidden rooms and basement workshops into secret scriptoria. His original transcripts became the master copies for a massive, clandestine publishing operation. These forbidden texts were then smuggled out of Prague in merchants' carts, tucked into bundles of cloth, and carried by travelers across Bohemia and into neighboring lands. The impact was explosive. Jan Hus himself was eventually captured and burned at the stake, but his voice, preserved by the scribe's defiance, could not be silenced. The smuggled writings circulated from village to village, read aloud in town squares and discussed in peasant homes. They fueled a popular uprising, uniting nobles, knights, and commoners under the Hussite banner. This was not merely a theological dispute. It erupted into a series of devastating religious wars, the Hussite Wars, where peasant armies famously defended their faith against crusades sent by the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. The scribe, whose name is lost to us, had understood a power that the authorities did not. He knew that an idea, once copied and set free, becomes an army. His legacy was not a single secret revealed, but 1,000 copies made, proving that the most dangerous thing you can do with a forbidden thought is to share it. The whispers of these 25 scribes echoed far beyond the walls of their scriptoria and chanceries, their individual acts of defiance converging into a historical tide that reshaped the medieval world. The temporary scandals they ignited were merely the flashpoint. The true impact was the fundamental restructuring that followed. Wars ended not with a climactic battle, but with a leaked treaty that made conflict pointless. Governments did not simply change rulers, they saw their very foundations of power exposed and reformed. The economic dominance of a merchant guild could be shattered overnight by a single bookkeeper's ledger, redistributing wealth and opportunity across an entire region. These disclosures revealed a profound and unsettling truth for those in power. A system built on a foundation of secrecy is inherently fragile, vulnerable to the conscience or the greed of the one person entrusted with the keys. This realization sparked an arms race in the shadows. Kings and popes could no longer rely solely on oaths and fear. They had to build systems. The clumsy, personal espionage of rival courts evolved into more sophisticated networks of counterintelligence, dedicated to rooting out leaks from within. The haphazard safeguarding of documents gave way to stricter protocols, complex ciphers, and a new paranoia about who was allowed to read what. In many ways, the modern concept of state secrecy, with its classified tiers and need-to-know principles, was forged in the fiery aftermath of these medieval betrayals. The scribe who leaked for conscience became the ancestor of the whistleblower, a figure who forces a painful but necessary reckoning with the truth. Their collective legacy is a powerful and enduring paradox that those entrusted to quietly record history when pushed to their limit are sometimes the very ones who take up the pen to rewrite it. From the cloistered scriptorium to the bustling royal chancery, the stories of these 25 scribes reveal a timeless truth. Those entrusted with secrets hold a power that can preserve empires or shatter them. We have journeyed through tales of moral courage, tragic weakness, and calculated risk. witnessing how a single act of disclosure could redirect the course of nations, sparking wars, toppling dynasties, and preserving cultures from the brink of erasure. These narratives challenge us to consider the weight of our own loyalties and the price of truth in our own lives. When does your duty to a principle become more important than your duty to an organization or a leader? The echoes of their quills remind us that history is not just written by the victors on grand monuments, but also by the quiet scribes in the background who dared to tell a different story, preserving a fragile truth for the future to find. We invite you to share which of these stories resonated most with you in the comments below, and to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories that shaped our world.